So, thank you very much. It's a pleasure for me to be here. Let's go straight to the point. I just want to say that by nature, I'm a biomedical researcher, so I'm what I consider myself a realistic optimistic. Okay, so I'm really a person that I believe in the future. Okay, so I'm not. So the questions will go into that direction, and not so much into like the dangers of there is dangers, but how can we really solve problems?
Yes.
So as you said, there is an immense human potential. And one of the things that we have shown through is that we created amazing things, philosophy, art, science. And they all use different methods, they all different tools, but they all are in this pursuing that we have to understand the world around us. I'm obviously biased towards the scientific method. I think it's the best one and better than the other ones. But it's undeniable that throughout history, scientific discoveries have really changed our way of living. Yeah. And they really have frequently changed long-held beliefs and disrupted societal norms. But of course, these took decades, centuries sometimes. Now they need to take days, seconds. Okay? So really, we would like to see your point of view. How can we really, balance between embracing the power of science and the scientific discoveries, but then at the same time ensuring that its implications are accepted not as a dictatorship, are accepted because they are people understand them by societies, by different individuals. How you see this balance, to go through such a fast process?
Yeah, it's difficult. I think two things about science. First of all, science is about reality, and reality is extremely complicated. It sounds obvious, but it's important to say it, because all people are lazy, all of us. I'm also, we are lazy, we don't want to think very hard. And science forces us to think very, very hard, because our minds really were not adapted by evolution to understanding things like viruses or like evolution itself. And you see in human history, you talked about art, you talk about philosophy, that what humans create with their own imagination tends always to be much more simple than what science discovers. If you want to know, for instance, the difference between mythology and science, is that science is far more crazy than any mythological idea ever dreamt up by any religion or any culture in the world. Most mythologies, they simply take our daily life and magnify them. Like you have a family, your mother and father fight about something, and then you imagine Zeus and Hera, the gods, as a family with mother and father fighting about something. You think about also Christian or Jewish theology. So in the end, it's a lost boy looking for his mother or his father. What is hell? If you ask theologians, so if you ask the common people, hell is where demons roast you alive in fire. But theologians will tell you, no, it's when the soul loses connection with God. That's hell. And this is simply a boy lost his connection with his father or his mother. Very difficult for us evolution has scripted a very limited repertoire of biological dramas, and almost all of human art and mythology, all the Netflix series are just these biological dramas again and again and again. And science, we look at quantum mechanics, you look at the evolution of viruses. This is a completely different thing. And we find it very difficult to understand it because we were built, again, for this limited repertoire of biological dramas. And then we fall prey to all kinds of conspiracy theories and so forth, which are, again, tend to be very, very simple. To understand what a virus is so complicated because we never encounter them. They are inside us, around us, but we never encounter them because they're just so tiny. And we are not even sure are they alive or not. Viruses, they don't eat. They can't reproduce by themselves. they are just tiny bits of genetic code that can hijack the mechanisms of our body to produce more of them. This is such a strange thing. You don't find in any human mythology such a strange idea. And then when somebody comes along and tells you some conspiracy theory about viruses, it's much more tempting.
Of course.
And the other thing about science, I'll try to be short, is that science is ultimately based on admitting ignorance. The big discovery that launched the scientific revolution was not some discovery of Copernicus in astronomy or in geography. It was the discovery of ignorance. For all of history, human cultures believed we know everything. We have all the answers in this holy book, of that holy person there, he or she knows everything. Science began, real modern science began, when a culture, an institution, admitted we don't know. Nobody knows the answers to some of the most important questions in the world. Let's investigate. And again, this is very difficult for people. They want answers. They don't want this open-ended investigation.
Let me go on with that subject, because technology created an impatient society. We are very used, not even to the short term, but to the nano term.
To the immediate.
Everything solved by now. And technology made it possible in millions of ways. But democracy relies on procedures, on bureaucracy, on dialogue, on consensus, on time. And populists exploit very much the mismatch of expectations that people are now having with democracy.
Yeah.
So my question is, how do you see this? And how do you see if it's possible for the democracy to speed up, keeping the structural rules that we rely upon? And can artificial intelligence play a role on that fight and endeavor?
So ultimately, the answer is no. We cannot speed up beyond a certain point. Democracy is a conversation. Conversation takes time. Different people need to voice their opinions. You need to actually listen to them. This is the hardest thing in the conversation, to actually listen to the other side, take it seriously, maybe change your own views a little. It takes time. Dictatorship can be instantaneous. You have one person dictating everything, tak, tak, tak. The problem is, with dictators, with all these strongmen and populist leaders, that they assume infallibility. And nothing in the world, certainly not in the world of humans, nothing is infallible. All leaders make mistakes, all books contain errors, all institutions make mistakes. If you build a political system based on the assumption of infallibility, it will lead to disaster. The whole idea of democracy is that we assume that everybody makes mistakes, so we don't give absolute power to any one member of the system, and we always have a kind of self-correcting mechanism that can identify mistakes, even of the biggest leaders, and correct them. And even the self-correcting mechanisms themselves make mistakes, so we must have several self-correcting mechanisms. It's not enough that we have, a government and a parliament balancing each other. We also need an independent judiciary. We also need a free press. We also need universities. Why? Because any element in the system can make mistakes. So we need to have all these different self-correcting mechanisms that keep each other, and this takes time. It cannot be instantaneous.
One danger also of science and technology, when they come with something that really can impact a lot in society, and for example, in tackling global health crisis, as we see in the pandemic, is that science responded really fast and in an amazing way. Of course, it was not as fast as people think, because it's been decades of research, but at that time, the science and knowledge was there to respond. But one thing that as a society we really fail is the fact that this science and technology that we have developed develop is not accessible to everyone the same way. And we frequently really have marginalizing, type of groups of people or, social economical groups, etc. And this is really one point that then the populists and everything use, because it's these people that feel marginalized that are there. So how can, really, what should a society, as a global society, not probably as individual nations, but as global society, should we do to ensure that, science technology is more accessible to everyone?
No, I think it's partly the responsibility of scientists themselves to devote some of their time and energy to conveying the latest discoveries and ideas to the general public. Of course, it can't be everything they do, because then nobody does new research. But this, for instance, is what I see as my role, to serve as a bridge between the scientific community and the general public, and to write books for adults, for children. Like my latest project is to write a children's book, a series of books about the history of the world from the Stone Age to today, aimed at children. And the idea there is exactly that if scholars don't make the effort to reach the public, they are leaving a vacuum which is easily abused by populists, by conspiracy theories, by fake news. And of course, it's difficult for scientists, because they are trained to think and write in a way which is often inaccessible to the general public. The most important thing to know about humans in this respect is that humans are storytelling animals. We think in stories, but in many branches of science, like in biology, scientists try to write and even think in statistics, in equations, in isolated facts. They are suspicious of stories. And they are suspicious for a good reason, because every story contains elements of fiction, of simplification.
Lack of rigor.
But that's the job. If you say, no, I'm not going to tell any story, I will just present the public with these statistics and mathematical equations, you lose the public. So, of course, again, it's not the job of all scientists to do that, but we need people to serve as a bridge, because ultimately, as I said earlier, the stories of science, potentially, they are the most amazing stories ever. There is no human mythology that comes close to the kind of, again, craziness of evolution or of quantum mechanics. So if you know how to tell this story in the right way, it has a chance to captivate billions.
Yuval, open societies, if we look back, usually led progress. Progress in ideas, arts, science, industry, agriculture, wealth. And they learn from each other, they shape ideas that can improve lives, they foster tolerance, they welcome diversity. And although being well aware that artificial intelligence may well serve a digital dictatorship that can close countries or societies, can we still rely on the strength of the open societies? A digital dictatorship is not destined to fall because of its closeness, as all the closest regimes did in the past?
That's wishful thinking a little. Especially when we look at the 20th century, we tend to adopt an overly complacent attitude to 20th century history and tell ourselves that the ultimate defeat of totalitarianism was inevitable. That it was inevitable that in the end the Nazis will be defeated, that the Soviet Union will collapse, that the regimes like of Franco in Spain and Salazar in Portugal, they're bound to collapse in the end. And I think this is being complacent. The Nazis and the Soviets were frighteningly close to winning, to taking over the world. Closed societies have their own strength. They are not a good place to research the truth, but they are very good at imposing order. And order is power. And we need to be realistic about it so that we make greater efforts. We cannot rely on history to fight our wars for us. We don't need to do much. Open society, it will definitely defeat the dictators because you have greater economic growth and more technological inventions. You know, in the Second World War, in many fields, the Nazis were more advanced. They made the wrong bet. They bet, for instance, on jets and on jet airplanes and on rockets and not nuclear weapons. And they were far more advanced than the Allies, for instance, in rockets. Ultimately, the rockets that brought the Americans to the moon were based on Nazi technology. So we shouldn't be complacent about that. And again, a few different decisions during the critical years of the war, 1941, 1942, and there was a realistic chance that the Nazis could have won. Open societies definitely have huge advantages. Their biggest advantage is their ability to identify mistakes and correct them. But they pay a price, and it's much more difficult to build a consensus in an open society. When you have to move fast, sometimes ruthless dictators have an advantage. So again, I hope that in the 21st century too, the open societies will prevail, but for that we'll need to make a very serious effort. We cannot rely on some law of history to ensure that.
And in these open societies, we need to deal with dilemmas. As every time that science evolves and brings a new tool, a new way of seeing life, we need to deal with these dilemmas that can be related to genetic engineering that are already there, so it's not something of the future, it's something in fact of already past and present, artificial intelligence that we already mentioned, and the potential for human enhancement that people are already starting to talk really in high levels. So how can then we effectively navigate these ethical challenges in an open society, but ensure that scientific progress aligns with human values? Because, when you have now artificial intelligence, and there will be a lot of aspects of human enhancement that we can probably operate and could be seen as something good, But how can we really? I'm not saying that I'm not so much in favor that we should put a break, because science will never be able, as you already mentioned, we'll never be able to slow down. Science is there, and our curiosity will drive the science. But how really can we align these ways of human values and what we accept from science for the future, and to be making a much more a better human society? How we would?
Yeah, I think the key first step is for scientists to realize that they can no longer completely isolate themselves from politics. That there still is a scientific ideal that I'm in the laboratory, I'm doing my thing, it has nothing to do with politics, I don't want to get involved in politics. And scientifically speaking, that's true, because we don't want political views dictating your research, the outcome of your research. But what we see more and more is that science can no longer isolate itself from politics. In more and more fields, the most important political questions are scientific questions. Climate scientists, a few decades ago, they thought, we are just scientists. We have nothing to do with politics. We don't want politics. But now they are forced to do politics. Climate science has been completely politicized. During the pandemic, I think one of the shocks for doctors, for epidemiologists, was to realize that they cannot escape politics anymore. They thought, we are just doing science. But people told them, no, you're doing politics. And it's now happening with AI. It will happen with more and more fields. Because science changes the world, and politics is ultimately about these changes, so politics and science are now merging in an inextricable way. Now, scientists should still be loyal to the basic scientific value of objectivity, that if you have I'll give an example from my field, like history. that I care very much about suffering of animals. And when I researched the Stone Age, humans in the Stone Age, I wanted to discover that humans were vegan in the Stone Age, and that eating meat became widespread only after the agricultural revolution. Like, this is kind of, you can say, this is my politics. But the evidence didn't support my the conclusion that my politics wanted to find. The evidence pointed out that humans ate a lot of meat, and it was an important a part of evolution. If our ancestors hadn't eaten meat, probably we would never have developed this big brain. Still, I think we should not eat so much meat now and be very mindful of the suffering we inflict on other animals. But when it comes to the scientific research, I stick with the evidence. Still, while sticking with the evidence, we should understand that we can no longer isolate ourselves from politics. If we try, it would come knocking on the door or barging in. What happened to the climate scientists, what happened to the epidemiologists, is likely to happen to more and more fields. And therefore, we need to be out there, and especially to protect things like academic freedom. Whenever the academic freedom of any discipline is threatened, scientists in other disciplines should understand this can happen to me too. You know, we don't need to go to China or Russia. In the EU, you have Hungary as a member state of the EU, which closed down all departments of gender studies in an act of political violation of academic freedom. And if they now do that to gender studies, down the road, it can be any other department. So again, I think that we should, as scientists, we must stay loyal to the scientific values of objectivity, but understand that we also have to take political stance, because politics will no longer leave us alone.
Certainly.
I don't know if the room is feeling the same kind of apocalyptical tone here, which is, to me, it's a form of utopia, apocalypse, and an utopia that populists use and exploit very well to bring the savior. And I'm a rational optimist. I want to relentlessly work to the progress that we have been enjoying. So we almost end up this conversation by thinking that people will be influenced, people will be led by machines, by artificial intelligence. So if democracy relies on people's will and people are deciding badly, maybe democracy is not the way. So one can end up thinking that, okay, to fight the digital dictator, we need a good dictator. And that's where the populists also come. So as a rational optimist that myself, I'm just asking you for some kind of guidance and hope. How can someone who is in politics or not fight the good fight for freedom and open societies?
First, we need to realize, again, that democracy is not isolated from technology. Democracy is always dependent on technology, especially information technology, because democracy is a conversation. Now, in ancient times, you could only maintain democracy in very small societies. Hunter-gatherer societies were mostly democratic. We have examples like Athens, like Rome, which were democratic because they were small city-states. Once they expanded, they stopped being democratic. We don't have any example of a large-scale democracy encompassing millions of people over thousands of kilometers before the late modern age. Why? Because the technology was not there. Even if you wanted to have a large-scale democracy, let's say in Portugal in the 16th century, or in ancient Rome, you could not hold a real-life, real-time democratic discussions of politics because you didn't have the technology. In Athens, everybody can come together in the main square and talk. But if you're a kingdom, you can't do that. democracies, large-scale democracies, for the first time became possible only with the invention of modern information technologies. First of all, the printing press, and then newspapers. All the first modern democracies were based on the newspaper as the technology that enables a public conversation over a large territory. And then you had radio and the telegraph and television and so forth. And every new information technology, because democracy is built on information technology. It's not something on the side. We have democracy and we have technology on the side. No, it's the basis. Every time you change the basis, the structure shakes. So we had it in the early 20th century, when the same information technologies that made it possible to expand democracy also made it possible to build totalitarian regimes. Hitler and Stalin, they used the radio, the telephone, the same tools as democracies. In the 1960s, you had another round of new technologies and another round of democratic upheavals. Now, if you looked around the world in the 1960s, you would be likely to think that democracy is over and the future belongs to communist dictatorships. Because if you look at the years like 1968, first of all, you have very few democracies. Even in Europe, Spain, Portugal, there are still dictatorships. And even the democracies seem to be collapsing. 1968, in France, in Italy, in the United States, there is so much violence, assassinations, and meanwhile, the communist dictatorships seem to be completely stable. Nothing moves. And then you fast forward 20 years, and it's the communist dictatorships and the fascist dictatorships which collapsed. And the democracies, again, going back to what I said earlier, it's not a law of history that they always prevail. But they have a built-in ability to adapt better than any other regime. Because they don't concentrate all the power in one place, they have these self-correcting mechanisms, so they are much more flexible, they are better at adapting. I cannot make any promises about the current wave. Again, we have a revolution in information technology leading to the entire structure of democracy is shaking. Hopefully, we can adapt again and come out of this upheaval with even stronger democracies, like in previous times. That each of these previous crises, it led to a stronger democracy. Now, and it's in our hands. The technology will not regulate itself. We need another round of democratic conversations about how to manage the technologies. I mentioned earlier some basic ideas, like you have a law that you cannot counterfeit people. You cannot counterfeit humans. That's very simple. If the big tech companies knew that if my platform allows fake humans, I'm going to jail for 20 years, in the same way that if I own a printing shop and I allow people to print fake money, I go to jail, then immediately you will see a huge drop in all these problems of fake news and conspiracy theories and so forth. And you have people like Elon Musk saying freedom of speech, freedom of speech. Bots don't have freedom of speech. Only humans have freedom of speech. So regulation that gets rid of all the bots or forces AI to identify as AI when it talks to you, this doesn't violate freedom of speech.
Okay, we ran out of time. Thank you.
A lot.
Thank you very much. Let me just say toda, another Hebrew word. I hope I said it correctly. We end up here. I'm presenting the show. Thank you very much, and see you again.
Thank you very much.